This episode of the Cosmic Skeptic podcast is brought to you by you. To support the podcast, please visit patreon.com/Cosmic Skeptic. So welcome back, everybody, to the Cosmic Skeptic podcast. Today, I'm joined by Dr. Michael Shermer, who is a historian of science, the editor-in-chief of the magazine Skeptic, and a monthly contributor to Scientific American. He's also the author or co-author of nearly 20 books. I think it's sitting at 19 right now, if I'm not mistaken, including the most recent, which is Heavens on Earth, a book that I'm hoping to discuss today. So, Dr. Shermer, thank you for being here.
Yeah, here's actually the UK cover.
Oh, somebody sent me this. That's quite funny.
Okay.
It's the wrong way around.
Yeah,
So somebody sent me this from the US. This is actually a signed version,
all right.
which I think someone picked up at your event with Frank Turek. That's either this or another event that we did. But
Right.
yeah, and I watched that online, and that was quite an interesting debate that you guys had. But okay, so what I wanted to talk about essentially is the book, but mainly focusing on the concept of death, which is something that you talk about a lot, and where the afterlife kind of came from that, and how the human psychology and how socially we are reacting to the concept of death. So I suppose for a start, if you could just give a sort of brief overview of the purpose of the book and what it was you were trying to do with it, and kind of an overview of the contents before we get going.
Yeah, so Heavens on Earth was something of an extension of my previous work. I've written on science and pseudoscience, and science and religion, and science and morality, science and politics and economics. So it was sort of a natural extension to write about the biggest subject of all, I guess, is the afterlife and immortality and what happens when you die and so forth. But the main focus of the book is not so much on the religious versions of the afterlife and what scientists think about that, although I have a big chapter on that, a couple chapters on that. But the main focus is on scientific attempts to achieve immortality. That is kind of an afterlife for atheists, in which the idea is you are cryonically frozen, or you engage in transhumanist technological and scientific upgrades. You're going to upload your mind into the cloud, into the singularity when that comes, when we have enough computing power, and so on. All these are attempts to achieve a very ancient dream of living forever. And so then I get into the question of the psychology of why we would have that dream in the first place. No other animals that we know of are aware of their own mortality to the point of constructing some kind of afterlife in which things continue beyond the body. We know other animals grieve at loss, but that you might expect from any social species like that, who gets attached, particularly pair bonded or close to other group members, and then they lose them. They naturally feel bad about that. But that's different than conceiving of an immortality. Earliest grave sites, maybe 50 to 100,000 years or so of Neanderthals and early Homo sapiens, indicate that they kind of set up their lost loved one with tools and flowers and arrange the bodies in the grave in a certain way that it sort of looks intentional, like maybe they were thinking that person will continue on in some other form. Of course, that kind of thinking doesn't fossilize, so we don't know for sure. But it's not inconceivable. It's not a crazy idea to think that the idea of an afterlife or a heaven or the soul or something continues on. It goes all the way back 100,000 years or so. Cognitively, we are naturally dualists. We tend to think that there are two substances in the universe. There's material and immaterial, corporeal and incorporeal. There's body and soul. There's brain and mind. We have this idea from a very early age. For example, Paul Bloom's research at Yale shows that very little children under age 3, just through a clever experiment with puppets in which one of the puppets dies, and then the question is, well, where does it go? And and at a very early age, I think it's closer to age 4, these children have some idea that that the little mouse that died, that the mouseness continues on somewhere else, that the soul of the mouse or the spirit of the mouse or whatever. The little children don't have quite the right language that adults have to describe that, but the idea that you cannot conceive of not being alive. That is to say, this would be true for all of us, that if I say, imagine yourself dead, you can't do it, because to imagine something, you have to be alive.
Right.
Death would just be the closest analog we have. Is not even sleep, because in sleep you're dreaming. Would be general anesthesia. You just, they give you the injection. It's 3, 2, 1, lights out, and that's it. Now you come back, but there's no time in there that you keep track of. It's just missing time, 3 hours or whatever you were out. And so death would be something like that probably, but you just never wake up.
Sure. Yeah, I think it's whenever I spend a long time trying to figure out what the best way of imagining non-existence or imagining nothing is. And the best that I've been able to come up with is if you close only one of your eyes and try to describe what you're seeing out of that eye, because you don't even see the blackness, because it kind of just doesn't register. It's such an odd thing to think about. But when it comes to this kind of Descartesian dualism that you're talking about, that seems to be, are you saying that that's something that's within, is that something that's just within humans, or is it something that's across the animal kingdom? And is there like a good evolutionary reason for this idea that we exist as kind of two substances, one within the other?
Well, that's a slightly separate question, though an interesting one that has to do with possibly theory of mind and projecting yourself into other people so that you can anticipate what they might be thinking, so-called mind reading. And other species seem to have something like that. For example, there's the red dot test. If you put a red dot on a chimp's forehead, you put it in front of a mirror, it looks and kind of pokes at it like it knows that's me in the mirror. Right. So that requires some higher cognitive function to be not just aware of you, but aware that I'm somebody, and also aware that you're aware that I am somebody, and I'm aware that you're aware that I'm aware that you're aware, and so on. That kind of meta thinking requires some sophisticated cognition that cetaceans like whales and dolphins and elephants and chimps seem to have. Children at about age 4 get this. Other species like dogs, probably not, doesn't look like it, although dogs are really good at reading human nonverbal language. But that's probably because they evolved from wolves that were co-evolving with us on the periphery of these small groups. That's different than what we're talking about here. I think it's probably unique to us, but whatever its evolutionary origins, whether it's adaptive, I'm more likely to think of it's just a byproduct. I can't think of not being alive, but I see death all around me. So how do you square that circle? It's something of a paradox. I can't conceive of being dead, and yet I know death is real. So one solution to that is, well, you don't actually die. Your physical body dies, but there's something else. And that something else being a soul or whatever that, floats off the brain and goes off into wherever it goes, the quantum field or heaven or something like this, that I think I'm not convinced there's any adaptive reason for that. People have speculated, well, maybe it reduces anxiety, death anxiety. There's this theory called terror management theory that I'm pretty skeptical of. But in any case, either way, it's an interesting question, and the bottom line is here we are, and we have this capacity, and it's generated a lot of ideas over thousands of years, and has been a major driving force behind religion.
Yeah, well, that's something I wanted to ask you about, and maybe we can touch on terror management theory, what it is, and why you think it's flawed, because you also kind of propose an alternative within your book that you think is more accurately describes human psychology. But would you say that this that religion, as you just kind of alluded to there, are you sort of suggesting that religious belief might spring out of an obsession or an interest in death specifically, rather than other cultural factors? Do you think that death is kind of the main driving force behind the construction of these ideas?
I don't. I think death is way down the list of important reasons why people adhere to religion, why religion evolved in the first place. I'm more along the lines of what's called the Big Dodds Theory, that as small bands of hunter-gatherer bands and tribes coalesced into larger chiefdoms and states, and you move beyond the Dunbar number of about 150 people that you can know fairly well, And when you're in a small group like that, informal means of behavior control and enforcement of moral rules and norms and eventually laws, it's too hard to control that in groups of thousands or tens of thousands. So the idea is that the kind of animism, spiritism of hunter-gatherers then evolved into polytheism and monotheism of God's up there watching you. So if you, in this big, huge group of 10,000 people or 100,000 people or 1,000,000 people, say 5, 6, 7,000 years ago, if you think you got away with it because no one saw you, there's an eye in the sky that keeps track of it all. It's a way of enforcing norms and rules. And I think the evidence for that is pretty good. I like that theory better than people adhere to religion because they're afraid of death. Now, if you ask people, surveys, psychologists of religion do this, why people believe in God, fear of death is, it's pretty way down the list. Now, of course, at the end, you're given the last rites or you've been given a death sentence by your doctor, stage 4 cancer or whatever. Yes, of course, then people start thinking about that. And religions then will focus on that, and at funerals and so forth, wakes and whatnot. There's a lot of liturgy around that, but in terms of the average person on any given religious holiday or ceremony, that's not what it's about. It's about community, social capital, enforcement of norms and rules, and being a good person and taking care of the poor and needy, and being an altruistic, pro-social, cooperative, good, moral person. That's really what is behind religion, I think.
Right, but then the terror management theorist would say that itself, the kind of the culture, the societal cohesion that you're saying religion sprung out of, that itself sprung out of a fear of death, of an implicit and constant realization and knowledge that you're headed towards this end, this ultimate end, and that's what's driving the ability for social cohesion. There's lots of studies that seem to suggest that when people are reminded of death, they act very differently and they're more likely to focus on social cohesion and things like that. But you don't seem to like this idea very much.
That is what they say, and that's exactly what they argue. It was well articulated. I'm skeptical of that. First of all, it's mostly dependent on subconscious motives that are hard to access, so they have to do these careful experiments to do that. And we know that a lot of that kind of unconscious, like with unconscious racism, with this test, the IAT, is not too reliable. It hasn't been replicated as much as we'd like, but more importantly, there's better explanations. In other words, my explanation counter to the terror management theories, they're not measuring what they think they're measuring. They say, we're telling subjects think about death, and therefore they act differently. So that's the independent variable. But I don't think so. I think something else is going on there that I think has more to do with enforcement of rules and morals.
Yeah. So, I mean, could you give us perhaps an example of a study which people have taken to support terror management theory, but could also be explained to support your view?
Well, like the famous experiment with the judges, in which they give harsher sentences after being primed with these, think about death or, it's sort of mortality priming. I think it has more to do with kind of reminding people of the importance of a moral system in the here and now, and that we have to have justice now, and priming somebody for mortality reminds them that justice should be done now.
Right.
And therefore we give harsher sentences. That's how I would interpret that.
But okay, so even if rather than instilling a kind of terror that needs to be managed, it instills a need for social cohesion, does that not still suggest that death is a driving force behind lots of social behavior?
One factor. And again, I would put it far down. Like, for example, terror management theorists, they go on and on about how, terror, the terror managing the terror of fear of death has driven people to be creative, and art, music, and poetry, and architecture, and and song, and dance, and come on, no one theory explains everything, and I think the evolutionary psychologists have a far better explanation for why humans try to be creative that has more to do with mating behavior than it does fear of death. And I quote at length in there David Buss's analysis of terror management theory from an evolutionary psych perspective, and I agree with his skepticism of it.
So you think that the religious expression and the social expression of mankind can be whittled down more to mating, essentially?
Well, as one factor, again, we're multi-causal, and most explanations for human behavior are overdetermined, as we say. That is, there's probably more variables proffered than are needed. You can kind of tease those out, but it's not one, and it's not 100. It's a handful, a half a dozen, or something that
I mean, the reason I ask, I don't mean to interrupt. The reason I ask is because if there are lots of factors, then something like mating, something like the drive for survival, can be seen as a backhanded way of avoiding death or managing death. Spreading your genes in the knowledge that if you don't do so, then you are finite and you need some way to continue. So there's still something to be said for the idea that it is, if the evolutionary course is driven by survival, then evolutionarily we are driven by an avoidance of death. That seems to be fairly logical for me.
Yes, okay, right. That makes some sense. Although, see, if you start with, say, Richard Dawkins' The Selfish Gene, and what would a molecule do to perpetuate itself? Well, first of all, it has to figure out how to duplicate itself, but then it has to be embedded in some kind of machine that can carry it forward and protect it in an environment that's hostile for some period of time. So I have a whole section in Heavens on Earth on why we have to die, and it has to do with this fact that there's no reason that natural selection would select for a body that lives forever when all you really need to do is reproduce to get the genes into the next generation. So maybe 2 generations is all you need. I need to get my offspring. I need to perpetuate my genes into my offspring, but I got to make sure my offspring get to an adult age where they have reproductive viability and have kids. So maybe grandparenthood is about the length we need. And after that, it would just be a waste of resources for natural selection to engineer a body that lives, say, 300 years or whatever. You just not need it. So in that sense, I guess I wouldn't call it fear of death. It's the logic of how evolution works, that the second law of thermodynamics, entropy, will grind away at bodies. And it would take an enormous re-engineering by natural selection to overcome those forces over the long run. So it's just easier to let the organism fall apart after some time when it's clear that the genes have been perpetrated.
Right, but taking that evolutionary reality and trying to adapt it is something that we're doing at the moment, or at least beginning to do as a species when it comes to efforts to prolong life or try to starve off death entirely. And that's something that you speak about a lot in the book as well. Is that something that springs from a personal interest? I mean, for a lot of people, death is one of their biggest fears, and the corollary for that is one of their biggest hopes is some way of extending life or avoiding death. Is that something that you share? Is that for any reason, like part of the motivation for researching this kind of stuff, or is it purely out of interest?
Yes, when I hit my 60s, I started researching this book because cramming for the final. It's coming up. No, actually, frankly, I don't really think about it that much emotionally. Maybe a little bit more now than, say, in my 20s or something. But
sure.
But I'm pretty physically fit and healthy and strong, and it's not something that feels like it's knocking on my door. I suppose maybe if 20 more years from now I'll feel differently about that. But I'm more intellectually interested in the subject. Although, like anybody else, I don't want the party to stop. I want the party to go on, and I want to be able to go to the party anytime I want.
Yeah.
Christopher Hitchens famously said, death is like, they tap you on the shoulder and say you have to leave the party now, and worse, the party's going to go on without you. It's like, oh no.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, with the offer of heaven, as Hitch famously said, this would be like you're tapped on the shoulder and told that you can never leave the party. It's like, well, no, that doesn't sound appealing either. So, right. And here I do debunk the idea that people have a sense of how long they should live, and then then it should end. This is nonsense. I mean, these are from surveys people take like when they're in their 20s. How long would you like to live? I don't know. And the answer they give is almost always pretty closely pegged to the average lifespan, say, 75, 80. And they go, yeah, I guess 80 sounds right. But of course, if you're 79 and tomorrow's your birthday, and I say to you, well, the Grim Reaper's coming tomorrow, would you like another week instead? Well, assuming you're strong and healthy and not on your deathbed, almost everybody would say, well, yes, of course. And then a week goes by, and here's the Grim Reaper coming tomorrow. Would you like another month? Oh, yes, I would take another month. How about a year? I'll take another year. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Now, of course, this doesn't apply to people that are deeply depressed and have severe diseases where they're they're barely living. That's a different scenario. But again, I think the idea of people wanting to live a long time, yes, I'm right on board with that. If I could go 150, 200 years and I'm still, physically feeling good and healthy and I could have 10 more careers, it would be great. I wouldn't say I would want 10 more wives, but
wouldn't it leave you with a sense of, I mean, because there is an ultimate finality, I understand the idea of extending life. Like if you could give yourself if you could give yourself forever, if you could live forever, then you'd probably take that perhaps. But if it's just a case of extending by 100 years or 200 years, I can see quite easily how if I knew from the start that I had an extra 200 years, I wouldn't be doing this. I wouldn't be bothering because I know how much time I've got. Would you?
Well, why not? Why wouldn't you?
Well, I feel as though even if death isn't the motivation in terms of fear, in terms of just terrified of death and doing things to distract yourself, essentially, as terror management theory has it, at the very least, it offers you a deadline. It says you have to have everything done by this point. I mean, it's like if you give a college student a deadline and they have months to do it, they're going to leave it until the last minute. It's just going to happen. But if you set them deadlines every single week, or you set it a lot closer, then they'll be more inclined to get on with the work. If you see what I'm saying.
Yeah, but Alex, how old are you?
20 now, actually. My birthday the other day.
20, yeah. Okay. So, I mean, essentially death is so far off, it's not something you even need to think about it. And yet here you are doing your podcast. Why bother? You could put this podcast off another 30 years. Why are you bothering?
But, I think I might do if I knew I had that extra 30 years, because there's something about and it may just be my status quo bias speaking, but there's something about the current life expectancy of maybe 100 years at best that allows you to really kind of separate life into stages. It's like if you don't get this done by here, then you won't get this done by here. You need to have your education done by the time you're 20. And when you're 20 to 30 or 40, you want to be getting started with your career so that you can peak and then you can retire at this age. It seems to follow that course. If you told me I had another 100 years, then I might just spend the next 10 years just relaxing, doing as little as I can, or being less motivated. Even if I was still doing things, do you not think it would lower the motivation in a way, even if it doesn't get rid of it entirely?
No, and I don't think you would. I think you'd get up in the morning and go, yep, I want to get out there and make my mark and do something fun and interesting and make some money and so on.
Right.
You still got to make money.
Yeah.
Just even if you live 200 years, you still got to get up and pay your mortgage tomorrow. This is my answer, by the way, to people that say, just live in the now. The now of roughly 3 seconds. The past is gone. You can't do anything about it. The future isn't here yet. This is my friend Deepak Chopra is always telling me, Shermer, just live in the now. Just relax, chill out. It's like, but Deepak, my mortgage is due next week. I got to work. I got to plan ahead. I can't live in the now.
Yeah.
All right. So in a way, it doesn't really matter how long you live. You still got to get up and go to work tomorrow. So the motivations are there for other reasons, I think.
But put it the other way, like if I told you that I'm going to shave off 20 years of the life that you have left, then wouldn't that motivate you to do more than you are already? Like if I told you that...
Yes. Yeah, of course. If I knew I was going to die, say in 6 months, I probably, there's some things I wouldn't bother doing, like long-term planning of a book or film project. I'd spend more time with my kid or something like that. But I do that anyway. I
But
mean, I spend a lot of family time just thinking, well, I'm thinking I'll live 80, 90 years, but I could get run over on my bike tomorrow.
yeah.
So there's no, I'm a cyclist, and in California, there's some risks. I could get run over. People are killed every year. Many people are killed on their bikes every year. This could definitely happen. So you have to balance it between, I'm not saving it all for the greatest 90th birthday of all time. And yet I'm not going to act like tomorrow's the end. Therefore, I have to drop everything and not do my work.
Right. But I'm not just thinking about it in terms of I give you 6 months to live. I mean, in the sense that if you told me that whereas I was going to die at 80 and now going to die at 50, like that's still a considerable amount of time to get things done, but I would feel more motivated, even though it's not an immediate thing. And even though, I could arguably get the same amount of work done if I just tried a bit harder, I'd want to try a bit harder and get it all done, even though that's quite an abstract, like, amount of time to take away, because I have no idea how I'm going to spend that time. For some reason now I'd still feel more motivated to get on with things. If I told you that you were going to have a 30-year life expectancy less than the average, then you might be more wanting to get out there and do stuff. But it just seems to me natural that the corollary of that is that if you extend your life, then that motivation level goes down.
I'm not sure. I mean, maybe we have an example of Stephen Hawking, who was giving essentially a death sentence in his early 20s. And that did kind of motivate him to finish his PhD and get married and have kids, kind of accelerate the process. But then he ended up living into his 70s. And so he just, like everybody else, got up every day and went to work. So, maybe the deadline rushed sooner makes you more motivated to get things done a little faster. I'm not sure the corollary of that, extending it out, double, triple the lifespan would change that. Although it's an interesting experiment. I mean, you could do it essentially with surveys. Imagine you're living 200 years. How would your life change? But people, I don't know how valuable the data would be. None of us have any idea what that would mean.
Yeah, you can only really get accurate results on that if you do it rather
so
cruelly.
Here's what I tell my transhumanist cryonics singularity friends. Look, just who say, Shermer, don't you want to live 500 years or something? Look, just get me to 90 without prostate cancer, and get me to 100 without Alzheimer's, and so on, where I'm just bedridden and don't even know who I am, and then we'll take it from there. I mean, if we can extend the life from, say, 120 of the upper ceiling to 150, okay, let's just try that. Because to do that, there's a whole bunch of problems you have to solve along the way. The ones I just mentioned, for example. I mean, for me, I'm a baby boomer. As in the next 20 years, the rates of Alzheimer's are just going to go through the roof, as we hit the wall. The projections are just really scary about Alzheimer's. Okay, if you could just solve that one problem, this would be a huge boon to humanity. It would be a great step of medical and moral progress and the quality of life and so on for so many millions of people. That, in other words, instead of worrying about living forever, let's just solve specific problems one by one and improve the quality of life, which is what we've been doing. So I make the point early in the book that it's a myth that people live twice as long now as they used to. If Darwin lived into his age 79 or whatever, people lived into their 80s, centuries ago, just not very many of them.
Yeah.
Now more and more people get up to the upper ceiling with quality of life. And so that's what we've been able to do through through medicine and hygiene and public health and so on. That's what I'm talking about, just solving specific problems.
So do you think that there is a way that we should divvy up the resources when it comes to the resources that we have to apply to life and the kind of concepts we're talking about? If we had to divvy it up between efforts to extend life and efforts to starve off death and understand how we can overcome it, and efforts to improve life as it is currently, like 80 years, most people today in the modernized world, if they live 80 years, like they're going to have a fairly good life on average. Can we kind of get to a point where we say that because everybody is doing so well, we should be focusing the resources rather on improving life, the quality of life, trying to take that quality of life that exists and extending it?
Well, we should do both. I mean, in terms of science, technology, and the economics behind it, we should be trying to lift everyone out of poverty, which we are. The rates of poverty have plummeted in the last 25 years, and they'll be zero according to the UN definition of poverty, if you accept that $2.90 a day or less. Extreme poverty, that'll be zero by 2030 at the latest. And, get everybody up to a living wage and so on. So from the bottom up, we should be doing that. And that includes all the stuff like the Gates Foundation does, is, distributing, vaccinations and potable water and mosquito nets and, just the, basic qualities of life kind of things from the bottom. Now at the top, of course, initially, only the wealthiest people are going to be able to afford these technologies that enable you to continue. But that's how it is with all technologies. Once it becomes popular to do, then the prices will drop and more people will be able to adopt the technology. That always happens. It's happened with computers. Now everyone has a computer, and it's happened with. It's happening now. We're right in the middle of one of these revolutions with electric cars. So the electric cars have been around for a century. There was many electric taxis in New York City in 1920 as there were gasoline-powered taxis in New York City in 1920. But then for various economic reasons and political reasons, fossil fuel industry and the internal combustion engine outcompeted the electric car. And so it just died until, they tried to bring it back in the 80s and 90s and it just didn't take off. And it really took Elon Musk to say, nope, we're going to do this. It's going to be expensive, fast, it goes far, and it's a super cool car to drive. I have one right here next to me. But now, instead of $100,000, they're $35,000. The price of a Toyota Corolla or whatever. And now all the manufacturers are bringing out super cool, fast electric cars that are fun to drive, that go hundreds of miles. And pretty soon everyone will have one. Everyone can afford it. And that's the same thing that'll happen medically for extending life. At first it'll be expensive, but eventually everyone can adapt it. And I think that's where we're heading. Now, you mentioned resources. It is important to address this, that, a typical response to this is that we shouldn't do this because, it's a finite planet. Well, again, let's solve that problem when we get there. This would be like saying, well, we better not engage in vaccinations, because then if so many people live, then we're going to run out of water and food and so on. So let people die. No, right. We're not going to do that. We're not going to do that. We're going to try to save people as much as we can. And again, I'm very skeptical of any of these proposed scientific technological theories about living 500 years. We're not even remotely close to being able to do this. So don't worry about the resources problem. Instead, we should be working on resources for other reasons, and that will take care of itself down the line if we do live 200 years or whatever. Because one of the things that people that are educated and economically well off and prosperous, they have fewer babies. And so the population curve is going to flatten out by 2050 or so and start to go back down. So even if we start living much longer lives, I'm not convinced that the overpopulation resource depletion problem is a serious one.
At least not yet. But if the end goal is to extend life like a currently unfathomable amount of time, hundreds of years, let's say, if that's kind of the end to which we're moving with this research, then is it not a little bit careless to begin this research, kind of not paying attention to the fact that eventually if we get to where we're trying to go in the end, we're going to have a massive problem in terms of overpopulation. People aren't going to want to stop having children. And especially if we can extend life in such a way that retains youth, people might be able to continue having children into their 100th year, their 200th year. Who knows? Like, it could bring untold problems, not only economically, but ethically, that perhaps we should really start thinking about before we even take a step in that direction.
Yeah, no, I disagree with that. This is the precautionary principle that ethicists talk about. I realize it's a legitimate argument. I don't buy it. I don't buy it because it's almost always used as a cudgel against new technologies that in the end almost always turn out to be good and rarely turn out to be bad. Okay, nuclear weapons would be an example of the latter one, I suppose, but even their nuclear power could counterbalance that. I say go for it. On any given technological revolutions, there's always this pushback. Oh my gosh, we're playing God. Oh, the precautionary principle. There could be consequences down the line. Same thing that happened with IVF, in vitro fertilization in the 1980s. Right. Oh, not just from the Catholic Church pushback, but secular arguments against it. Okay, and now I think it's like 1.5% of all babies born are born by IVF, and no one says a word about it ethically anymore. Nothing wrong with it.
Sure.
And So I think it'll go that way.
But so not just talking about a pushback though, because like take nuclear weapons for example. If you have a pushback against that ethically, people are still going to do it. Like people are obsessed, I think, with trying to extend life because of what I see as a fear of death, or maybe it's not a fear of death. Whatever it is, people really want to live longer. So these technologies are going to grow anyway. So I don't think a concern about the economic and philosophical implications of this is going to be seen or going to be successful as a kind of, you shouldn't be doing this, let's lobby against this. Just more like, we know you're going to do this is inevitable at this point, and we know this research is going to take place, so while you're doing that, let's consider how we can best react to this as a society.
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah, I would say I agree with that. Say in the same way with concerns about AI. I'm not concerned about it. I realize other people are, but as we push forward, sure, let's have committees and debates and talk about it. But again, just take it one step at a time. If there's a problem, solve that problem, whatever it is. And if it's one thing our species is really good at, it's problem solving. Very specific, narrow things. We have that problem right there. All right, let's put up $100,000 prize for anybody that can solve that problem, right. And boom, it gets done.
Yeah, okay. So, I mean, where are we at now economically with all of this? If I want to, if I'm somebody who is just terrified of death, which I am, by the way, like it is something that
you are really
it's
at 20.
I speak to a lot of people about this. It's something.
Oh my God!
It's something. It's something I talk to a lot of people about, and generally when I speak to people who are like-minded as I am, and people like yourself, people who don't believe in God and who are very who have promoted sort of enlightenment values and trying to find meaning in a meaningless universe, as your final chapter has it, they're very much, no, we shouldn't be scared of death. We should live in the now, and or not the now, but we should the now in terms of our temporal life rather than our afterlife. But to me, it's still something that is terrifying, and I think it's a fear of the unknown, perhaps. Is that not a fear that you share even a little bit?
Nope, not even a little bit. And when I was your age, this has been the last thing I thought about. I'm amazed to hear you say that. I mean, when you get up in the morning, do you think, oh God, this is really a dreadful day, I could die? No, you don't think that, do you?
Well, it's more like this is not a dreadful day, but I am going to die eventually. It's going to happen. Why should I get out of bed in the morning if it's all? You get into a very kind of nihilistic spiral, which is something that I imagine you would have, or like your last chapter, actually, meaning in a meaningless universe. This is kind of the center point of why I'm interested in philosophy, which is upon this realization that I don't think there's a God in the, governing the affairs of man. I don't think that there's this kind of transcendent purpose. Where can we find this motivation to get out of bed in the morning? Does that not, that finality of death and that finality of you and the concept that the ego, that the very thing that gives you existence, does that not in any way kind of just terrify you or make you think that maybe it's not all worth it?
Okay, so you remind me of Woody Allen's character Alvy Singer in his Academy Award-winning film Annie Hall, in which he has a flashback scene where young Alvy is 8 years old and he won't do his homework, and his mother takes him to the psychiatrist, and the psychiatrist, okay, Alvy, what's wrong? He said, the universe is expanding. He goes, what does that got to do with your own? Well, the universe is everything, and if it's expanding, then one day it's just going to all fly apart, and therefore nothing really matters, because he's an atheist anyway. And his mother says, what's the universe got to do with it? We live in Brooklyn, and Brooklyn's not expanding.
Right.
So I call that Alvy's error. That is, that we don't live, 15 billion years from now when the universe will be expanded beyond our existence or whatever the number is. We live now. We're on Earth. It's not expanding, and it doesn't matter what happens in 80 years or whatever. You live now, today, and tomorrow, this week. This is it. Make the most of it. Get up and get out and get going like you're doing. You're doing a podcast. This is cool.
Yeah.
And that's what most people need to focus on. Again, back to the, live in the now, not literally the now, because you do have to plan for tomorrow, but in the short term is what counts. And even whether there's a God or not, whether there's an afterlife or not, is irrelevant because we don't live in the afterlife. We live in this life. And whether there's a God or not doesn't matter because that shouldn't be your motivation for being a good person. for being socially conscious, for being productive, and there are much better reasons to do that. Just for its own sake, for goodness sake, and loving people for the sake of just for love. That's it. That's its own reward. You don't need the promise of an afterlife or a reward by God for living a good life. It's a much higher moral plane, I think, to do it for its own sake.
So you're suggesting kind of just changing perspective, because to me, I mean, you can still see that the nihilistic case, that essentially what you're suggesting is, yes, it's true that this is all going to happen. It's true that the universe is expanding, and it's true that everything has a finality, and eventually we're not going to be able to see the stars in the sky if the planet even exists then at all. But let's just kind of ignore that and change our perspective and focus on what's happening right now. It's like being in a car and you're traveling towards a cliff edge, and someone points out, look, we're going to roll off this cliff. And you say, yeah, but like, we're in the car. Like, the car isn't moving. Like, we're not moving inside
Yes,
the car.
okay.
We're still sat and having this conversation. Let's not worry about that. Let's live in the now. It's like, look, the car's still going to go off the cliff eventually, even if you try to kind of ignore that and focus on the perspective of being inside the car. You know what I mean?
Yes. Okay. So, well, the car analogy, I think it's too short term still. It would be like if you had a week to live. Yes, that would be very different than if you're just figuring, I'm going to live 80 or something. The 80 part is far enough out. You don't really have to think about it on a day-to-day basis. At least most of us don't. I suspect, Alex, yours interest in this subject is very personal and emotional. Mine's more intellectual. I get where you're coming from. It's entirely possible to talk yourself down that rabbit hole. I don't think it's very productive.
Right.
Intellectually, as a philosophical treatise, the nature of identity, who we are, what is the soul, what's the meaning of life. These are all super interesting questions. I love reading about this stuff and writing about it. But getting too invested in it in terms of like just getting up out of bed tomorrow, I think that's not productive.
Right, and that's an important distinction to make. I think that the intellectual endeavors that we make can inform our emotional sensibilities. So I think that an intellectual understanding of death and an intellectual understanding of our fear of death and where it comes from can help us manage the emotions. But like you say, I think that I can justify the change in perspective on an emotional basis, because like you say, it's just not productive. But intellectually, I think it's perhaps important to look at the bigger picture and see if
it'd be like saying, well, I just studied the free will determinism debate and I've decided I'm a determinist. So what's the point? Well, what do you mean, what's the point? I mean, it doesn't really matter whether you're a compatibilist, a libertarian free will, a determinist. You still got to get up and around tomorrow, and you act as if you have free will. You feel like you make free choices. So it's a useful fiction to believe in free will, even if it's completely illusion.
But I think that's part of the irony and absurdity of it. That's part of the thing that plays into the trouble that people have, is this idea that, like with the free will thing, you can convince somebody that determinism is true, or not even determinism, just that free will doesn't exist in some other sense. Maybe there's randomness in the universe, whatever it is. You can convince them of that, and within that argument, you can instill the necessity of the illusion of free will and the fact that we'll never be able to rid ourselves of that. And it almost makes it worse, because now you've got a bunch of people sat around thinking, I know that free will doesn't exist, but I can't help but act as though it does. It can drive people insane to think about the fact that they are acting in accordance with something that they truly believe not to be true, and they can't help it. That's quite a troubling prospect rather than a consoling one.
Yes, I guess. I first of all, I think the average person doesn't think about these things at all. So we're talking about a small percentage of the population that
Right.
is really into these big questions. Now, does it matter socially? Maybe. I mean, in terms of our understanding of human behavior and what side of the fence you're on about, say, nature, nurture, or free will and determinism, can affect how you think about, say, criminal reform and restorative justice versus retributive justice, for example. Yeah. So in my book, The Moral Arc, I have a couple chapters on this problem, in the sense that, if you have kind of an Old Testament view of human nature that, we're born evil, people are bad, and the only way to deal with them is the really bad ones is lock them up, and because they made bad choices, so that's kind of that libertarian free will that Christians believe in. monotheists believe in, because you need to be held accountable for your actions, and therefore punished or rewarded in heaven, and punished or rewarded here on earth, and so on. Now, that's not a very productive view of human nature. And so one of the reforms that's happened over the centuries since the Enlightenment is criminal justice. That is the abolishment of the death penalty, the abolishment of torture, and abolishment of death penalty almost everywhere except America. Even in America, it's only practiced by a couple of states, Texas, Ohio, just a few others. California, here where I'm at, we have the death penalty, but the last person executed, I think, was 1996. There are criminals in California who want to get on once they know they're convicted. They want to be on death row rather than a life in prison. Because they're going to have life in prison anyway, and the conditions apparently are better on death row than they are in the general population. Right. So, in other words, it's just not a practical thing. But I think what's behind it is the idea that it's not that the criminals have no responsibility, but that often the factors that drove them to do what they did are not the same kind of things that you and I have to deal with. They had horrific backgrounds: drug addiction, gang membership, damaged brains. They got no prefrontal cortex. It's just quiet. Their urges bubbling up from within. If you and I had those urges, we would not act on them. Other people can't control themselves. All right, so we've kind of taken into account that much of human behavior is more deterministic than we like to think, and therefore, that we have to adjust the law for that. So, for example, there's degrees of homicide, second degree, first degree murder, second degree murder, and so on. Crimes of passion, or crimes driven by drug addiction or brain damage. These are legitimate arguments, and so our criminal justice system has become much more humane, rational, scientific, and reasonable because of our changed theory of human nature. So there, I would say these kinds of debates do matter in terms of public policy and the law that affects all of us. So there, I would say, understanding the determinist position is important. Even if you say, well, I personally feel like I have free will, it's an illusion, but it's a good illusion. I recognize other people have different conditions. They simply cannot control them. I mean, people here in America, we have this opioid crisis. I mean, it's 50 more people are killed from drugs than from automobile accidents. But we treat them differently. We're like, well, you didn't mean to get in an automobile accident, but you chose to take the painkillers. Yes, I would say no, not so much. It's not the kind of choice that if you're not an addict, you would understand. It's the addict. Right. They really can't help it. They're going to do this. And so we have to take that into account. So there, I would say that these issues matter.
Sure, yeah. And without sort of delving too much into the determinism, free will debate, I believe I heard you saying once that you still fall down on the side of free will, if I don't...
Compatibilism.
Compatibilism, right.
Yeah, just think of the most famous defender of this is Dan Dennett in his book Freedom Evolves.
Right.
He has a concept of degrees of freedom. It's a spectrum. And I like that very much. I think we have degrees of freedom, some more, some less, within populations or species. Yeah. Yeah.
It's something that I outright reject compatibilism as a theory of free will. But the reason why I brought up the fear of death, rather than to get into that debate, which is one that I love having, and perhaps we could have another time. But the reason I brought it up was to say, look, I am somebody who's scared of death, who wants to put it off as much as possible. Where are we at right now, economically and technologically? Like, what can I do as someone like that? What are the options currently available to me?
Well,
other than just getting over it.
Okay. These are separate questions. I thought you were asking me what can you do to continue your life as long as possible?
Yeah, that's what I mean. Like,
yes. Okay. Well, we have a pretty good idea about that. Don't smoke. Minimum drinking, or
sure.
modest drinking, medium risk taking in terms of sports and things like that.
I want to live past 150.
Yeah.
I want to live on.
Okay.
What are the technologies that are open right now?
There is nothing. There's absolutely
nothing.
Nope. There is nothing. You can take all the vitamins and minerals and supplements you want, like Ray Kurzweil does, or you can get on board with Aubrey de Grey's program. But researchers that do this, that study aging, they tell me that Aubrey has these 7 things you have to do to try to re-engineer your cells so they keep duplicating indefinitely. We're not close to doing any of the 7.
Mm-hmm.
So really, forget it. You're not going to quit aiming for 150.
But so I don't just mean about.
Just aim for 80 or whatever. Okay, so eat a balanced diet, not too much alcohol, stay out of cigarettes. I mean, really, and work out every day. Do you work out every day? Because working out and exercising, cardiovascular every day, this is way better than anything else you could do besides not smoking.
You're really putting me on the spot there.
Okay, there you are, Alex. Here you are. You're thinking about this. What can I do? What can I do? There must be some magic pill. Just go work out every day. That's going to be way better than any of these imagined technologies that are not there yet.
Right, but there are technologies that aren't imagined, which you talk about in the book in terms of how we can take what it is that makes us us and preserve it either in ice or not ice, but preserve it frozen or preserve it frozen in the cloud technologically, or upload it to a computer, or preserve it in such a way that it can be uploaded to a computer. Where are the technologies at on that? Is that something that is as equally kind of this isn't going to work, this is ridiculous, or has that got a little bit more hope?
Yeah, for the mind uploading has almost no hope at all. Cryonics would be so for 2 reasons on that, but I'll come back to that. Now, cryonics is a better bet in my mind than mind uploading for 2 reasons. One, it gets around the problem of identity that I talk about with mind uploading. That is, the idea of mind uploading is that we are copying your connectome, all your memories, and converting it into a digital file and then uploading it into some other medium, say the cloud. That's not you. That's a copy of you.
Right.
Okay. So this is another huge philosophical problem, the nature of identity and so on. And my take on that is you have to have a continuity from one moment to the next of your point of view self. So you're not just your memory self, you're also your point of view self that is through the eyes, experiencing the world from one moment to the next. Now that continuity can be broken by sleep, for example, or general anesthesia, but you come back, your continuity return, your identity returns, the continuity continues. With cryonics, it would be like that. You would, I think, if we managed technologically to do this, not even close yet, but could happen in principle. I think it would just be like waking up from a long sleep or a general anesthesia. You'd have no memory because the atoms are all frozen in your molecules are all frozen in your neurons, so there's no memory. But you would then presumably wake up and be looking at the world through your eyes again, and so you could continue. That has a better bet than the mind uploading, which is you're still 6 feet under centuries ago or whatever when we finally turn on your digital file and bring you back. It's not you.
Okay, so it's a problem of personal identity, and you talk about the continuity thing. I find that interesting. So when you talk about like going to sleep or being under anesthesia, whatever it is, you come back. You said you come back to that body eventually. So that continuity returns to you. But like to me, that seems so. So when you're talking about making a copy of yourself, it's kind of like that Star Trek episode you mentioned, where because the transporter works by destroying you and recreating you somewhere else, and then you've got this problem where the first one doesn't get destroyed, and they meet each other, and who's actually the real guy. I'm not a Star Trek watcher, as you might be able to tell, but there is a continuity in the sense that, so if you were to go to sleep and you wake up, you say that continuity returns, right? Is that what you're suggesting? Because given that, let's say that you were able to sleep long enough that every atom in your body has been replaced by its natural processes, and then you wake up again, you wake up in a completely different body. But would you still say that continuity has returned to itself? Because if it has,
I would.
Then surely if I create that future you, that version of you that you're going to wake up in, completely new atoms, I'll restate, like if you fall asleep for, I think it's something like 7 years it takes for the body to fully replace itself. If I could take the atoms that would eventually form you in that 7 years' time, produce it right now next to you, and just transport you from there to there, you fall asleep in that body, you wake up in that body, surely that's the same thing as falling asleep and waking up in the same place, even though it's over a course of 7 years versus me taking you there right now. Like the continuity issue to me seems the same whether I take you from where you are now into a new body, or whether I make you go to sleep now and wake up in what is essentially a new body as well. I don't see why there's a relevant difference there.
I could see it, I guess, if you let's say you replaced your neurons one at a time over some period of time where and since the brain can't sense itself, you wouldn't even know this was being done, however it would be done. The continuity of your thoughts is still there. Yeah, you'd still be you. What you're proposing is that, but how do you transfer the thoughts from this platform to this other platform?
Well, who knows?
I mean, I agree. It doesn't have to be platform dependent. It could be any medium.
But is that the important factor here? How it's moved? Because essentially,
isn't it?
What we're talking about when it comes to falling asleep for 7 years and then waking up again is your consciousness being transported from one body across time into another. When we talk about moving you into a new body, it's your consciousness being transported from one space to another. So you're moving across space rather than moving across time. That's the only difference there, and I don't see why that would be relevant to what makes you you. And like you say,
okay, all right. So in that case, then there could be more than one you.
Right.
So with the Star Trek transporter, or let's say we upload your connectome, and now there's Alex. But we do this while you're alive. Let's say we have a sophisticated MRI brain scanner, and we scan your connectome, and we put it in a clone of your body, and now we have two Alexes, Alex 1 and Alex 2, each of whom thinks they're the genuine real Alex. That would just, so that's a kind of solution to the identity problem. There's just two of you. That's possible. And each of you thinks you're the real one, and your friends are, they can't tell the difference, and so on.
That's what Captain Kirk does in the end.
Yeah,
I watched the clip after reading about it in your book, and he just says, as improbable as it is, we now have two of these people on board, whatever his name is.
Right. That's right. Yeah, that's right. So that's one solution, maybe. Again, I think we're in such a realm of science fiction and metaphysics or whatever and philosophy that again, is this, are we even close to being able to do this? No, not even remotely close. So but again, I don't see you wearing the cryonics bracelet.
Right. Well,
are you signed up?
Maybe I would if it was a little bit cheaper. Who knows? But I mean, you say yourself in the book that
it's not that expensive. No, you just get an insurance policy, and for you, an life insurance policy is super cheap because you're 20. You could get it for I don't know, probably $100 a year or something on the premiums, and you just make the beneficiary, instead of your mom or your sister or whatever, you just make it the cryonics company is the beneficiary. They get the $100,000 of the whatever it is cost now, $250,000 for the whole body. You don't have to have a lot of money for that.
So why aren't people doing it? I mean,
why are people doing it? Because I think there's a couple of reasons. First of all, most people haven't thought about it all that much. Second, it's never been demonstrated. There's no experiment run that shows, look, we did it with a dog. The famous examples of dogs that come back, they're not frozen. They're just, their bodies are chilled, much like people that get open heart surgery and they bring the temperature of the body down, or people that fall into a frozen lake or whatever, and they're in there for half an hour and they bring them back. Well, it's that low temperature that matters, that keeps them going. But that's not being frozen. That's not minus 260 degrees in liquid nitrogen. That's very different. So proof of concept is super important. Once it happened, and I think that would be a game changer. And this could easily be done with a dog, for example. You just see if memories are still intact. Do they recognize their name? Do they remember where they lived, and so on? That would be a substantial step.
Yeah, and I suppose until that proof is substantiated, you'd be better off putting that $100 a month into a savings fund that you can give to your children or something. That's probably the way that people are seeing it.
Yes. Yeah. Right. But let's say you don't have to be rich to do this. You just have. I mean, I have 2 life insurance policies, for example. It's not that expensive, and I'm giving them to different people. And okay, so what? I mean, I could just add a third, or just make one of them the cryonics company. And I haven't done that. I'm not sure why. I guess in my position, it would be something of an endorsement of cryonics,
right?
And yet that I'm skeptical. But, somebody who, no one cares what they think, why wouldn't they do it? I mean, I'll ask you, why haven't you done it?
Well, I think, like
If
you
this,
say, it's perhaps because I haven't thought about it enough. I think that there seems to be something. There's something a bit terrifying about the idea of trying to edit nature. I mean, death has always been the finality. I mean, it's such an important concept in religion and culture and in everywhere. It penetrates everything we do in one way or another. So to try and kind of dip your toe in a technology that's trying to reverse that, it just seems like an incredibly unnatural thing to do. I mean, it's like gene editing or something. It's like, I can see why this on paper looks like a great idea, but it just doesn't feel right. Something's
well, but we've been doing that for a long time now, especially in the last century or so. It just since the Crick and Watson and the DNA, the CRISPR, all this stuff is coming, and it's big, it's exciting. But again, I mean, a lot of the medical ethicists are worried about CRISPR. I'm not worried about it. The medical ethicists are concerned, playing God and all that kind of stuff, and creating monsters or whatever. Look, just plow forward, and if there's a problem develops, stop. And believe me, government regulators have no problem jumping right into an industry and saying you're not going to do this anymore.
Right.
And so we're already doing the things that you said you're concerned about. It just feels differently when you're talking about like the ultimate. We're going to defeat death. Again, I'm coming at it from a slightly different side. Don't worry about death. Just try to solve specific problems that cause death. Like seat belts in cars. That was a solution to a problem that has reduced the levels of fatality dramatically.
Yeah.
Don't smoke. There's a whole bunch of things you could do. You don't smoke, do you?
No, absolutely not.
Oh, okay. There we go. We got one. You have one. So, just again, you're 20 and you tell me you're concerned about this. It's something you think a lot about. And yet you're not signing up for cryonics. You don't work out every day. There's a bunch of things you could do. You're not doing it. So how worried are you really? Or is it really just kind of more of an intellectual interest?
Well, that's probably going to keep me up at night now. Thanks very much for that. But given the absolute just nihilistic quality to almost everything we've been talking about, I think a good place to and speaking of finality and things coming to an end, that's probably a good place to leave it with that good piece of advice for all of our listeners. Get out of bed in the morning, do some exercise, sign up for freezing yourself in the hopes that one day you can be resurrected in another body that may or may not still be you. Advice that we can all follow. And I can only thank you for sharing with us. So unless there's anything else particularly that you wanted to add, I think that's a good place to end things.
Okay, sounds good. You're a very precocious young man. This is one of the better conversations I've had about my book. Thanks.
Well, thanks a lot. I'd love to pick your brains sometime about the free will determinism thing and the implications there. Perhaps we can do something like that.
You're in college, I presume. Are you?
That's right.
What are you studying?
Philosophy and theology at Oxford currently.
Good for you. Well, you should go on and get a PhD and be a professor and write books about all this grand stuff. It's good.
Well, I'll see if I can find the motivation, given that we're all going to die in the end. But we might be able to find it somewhere.
As I said, you still have to pay your bills tomorrow, so you got to do something.
Yeah, that's true. And yeah, well, speaking of paying the bills, if anybody wants to support this podcast, they can do so at patreon.com/Cosmic Skeptic. I want to thank everybody for listening, and especially thank you, Dr. Shermer, for being here. And I want to just remind you all that you can subscribe. If you're watching this on YouTube, you can do so here. If you're listening on iTunes, be aware that it's available on all these different platforms. Everything's in the description. But with that said, ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Michael Shermer.